Back in the 1980s, a man named Stanley Hordes became the state archivist of New Mexico. And almost immediately, people started coming to him. Hispanic Catholic families, old families, families who had been in New Mexico for 300 years. And they told him stories their grandparents had whispered to them, about strange habits, about foods their families refused to eat, about candles, about prayers spoken in a language nobody could identify anymore. Hordes spent years documenting these families. The academic world told him he was chasing folklore. Then the genetics labs opened. And what they found wasn't folklore. It was a BRCA1 mutation, a specific breast cancer gene variant called 185-DELAG, first identified in Ashkenazi Jewish women from Central and Eastern Europe. Genetic counselors in Denver started comparing notes in 2001. J1 had a Hispanic patient with the mutation, then another, then another. They were all from the same region, southern Colorado, northern New Mexico. And when geneticist Sharon Graw at the University of Denver ran the analysis, the result was exact. Not similar, not close, exact. The same mutation, the same ancient origin. Between 20 and 40% of Hispano-Catholic families in northern New Mexico carry Sephardic Jewish genetic markers. Let that sit for a second. If you're the kind of person who's always felt like there's something in your family history that doesn't quite add up, something nobody talks about, something that got passed down without explanation, then you're going to want to subscribe. Because this is only the beginning of what the genome has been hiding. Now, those families in New Mexico, where did they come from? Why did they have this? What happened to the people they descended from? The answer starts in Spain in 1492, and it starts with the worst ultimatum in Western history. Before we go any further, I want to know something about you. Does your family carry any ritual or habit that no one can fully explain? Something your grandmother did? Something your parents kept? That seemed to come from nowhere? Drop it in the comments right now, because by the end of this video, you might understand exactly where it came from, and it might be a lot older than your family's oldest story. Seville, Spain, February 6th, 1481, the first auto da fe of the Spanish Inquisition. 6 people burned alive in a public square, their official crime, practicing Jewish customs while registered as Christians. But here's what the records don't say. These weren't foreign immigrants. These weren't outsiders who had snuck in. Their families had lived in Iberia since the 1st century, since the time of the Roman Empire, when Jewish communities settled across the Mediterranean. By every legal definition, they were Spanish. More Spanish, in many cases, than the inquisitors judging them. The Spanish Inquisition had just declared war on itself. A historian named David Gitlitz spent years going through the Inquisition's own case files. What he found was extraordinary. Families being prosecuted 3 and 4 generations after conversion, families who had no conscious idea that their great-grandparents had been Jewish. They weren't secretly practicing Judaism. They were being prosecuted for muscle memory, habits passed down through grandmothers without explanation. That's the way a woman cleaned a chicken, the direction a family faced when they prayed, the specific way they washed their hands before a meal. Now think about that. The Inquisition was prosecuting people for things those people didn't even know they were doing. This wasn't about hiding. This was about forgetting, because forgetting was survival. If your children didn't know, they couldn't confess it. If the memory was dangerous enough, you stopped passing it on, and within 2 generations, it was gone, from the mind, but not from the body. Everything I just told you about conscious practice, hold onto it, because what the Inquisition actually succeeded in erasing was the memory. It did not succeed in erasing the mitochondria. In 2019, a research team led by Dr. Inigo Olalde at Harvard Medical School and the Center for Genomic Regulation in Barcelona analyzed genome-wide data from 271 ancient Iberians spanning 8,000 years of history. What they found was clear. There was no mass genetic departure from the Iberian gene pool in the 15th century. The Jewish families who were forced to convert, the vast majority of them, didn't leave. They stayed. They changed their names. They married their neighbors. And their genetics stayed right there in the Spanish population, invisible to history, invisible to the church, invisible to everyone, until the labs. A population geneticist working in Lisbon in 2012 tested 320 Portuguese men who identified as Catholic, Old Christian heritage, no known Jewish ancestry whatsoever. Yet 20% of them carried a genetic cluster indistinguishable from Sephardic Jewish populations, not descended from Jews, not similar to Jews. By every genomic measure available, they were the Jews. The conversion had been a legal document. The bloodline never signed it. That bloodline has a name in the research literature, a very specific genetic name. It's called JP58. The scientific classification is Haplogroup J1C3D. And within this sub-branch of the human Y chromosome, researchers identified something so precise, so rare, and so demographically concentrated that it acquired an informal name across the literature, the Cohen Modal Haplotype. Cohen, as in Cohen, the Hebrew word for priest. Now, this is not a religious label that got attached to a genetic marker after the fact. The marker came first. It belongs to a specific family of men who, according to both the Torah and the genomic data, trace their direct male line ancestry back to a single common ancestor, a man who lived approximately 3,200 years ago in the Near East, a man whose descendants became the priestly lineage of ancient Israel. Dr. Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona spent years on this specific question. In 2009, his team published a study in the journal Human Genetics using high-resolution Y chromosome analysis across both Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities, populations that had been geographically separated for over 1,000 years. The extended Cohen Modal Haplotype appeared consistently across both groups. It accounted for almost 30% of all Cohenim Y chromosomes sampled. And Hammer's team noted something that should have made front-page news. It was virtually absent in non-Jews. Now stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. It was virtually absent in non-Jews, except for one problem. It kept showing up in non-Jews anyway, in Catholic families in New Mexico, in Moroccan Berber communities, in mestizo families across Latin America, in places where standard population models had no mechanism to explain its presence. And in 2012, a Berber man from the Souss Valley in southern Morocco, a man whose family had practiced Sunni Islam for 12 documented generations with no oral tradition of Jewish ancestry in a village with no synagogue, tested positive for the extended Cohen Modal Haplotype. His Y chromosome carried the genetic signature of the ancient Levantine priesthood. His family name was Amazigh, not Semitic, not Hebrew. But his Y chromosome was telling a story that started before the first mosque, before the first caliphate, before the Arab conquests of North Africa, in a priestly bloodline whose temple had been destroyed by Roman soldiers in 70 CE. Think about what that means for a moment. If your Y chromosome carries JP58, you are not carrying a faint trace of distant ancestry. You are carrying the specific genetic signature of the ancient priesthood. Your direct male line ancestor, at some point in the last 3,200 years, belonged to that lineage. No baptism record, no conversion document, no census file changes that. The genome has no religion. But here is where Dr. Hammer's own data hit something that nobody has cleanly resolved. The oldest JP58 lineages, the deepest branches of the Cohen Modal Haplotype tree, predate the Torah's own account of when the priesthood was founded, by at least 400 years. The genetic clock places the lineage before the story says it began. The theological narrative and the molecular evidence are in direct contradiction, and the chromosome doesn't care which one you prefer. The timeline the Y chromosome broke was already being broken from the other side. From the mothers. Picture this: a woman in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a school teacher. Her grandparents emigrated from Portugal in the 1940s. She opens a DNA ancestry result on her laptop, the kind millions of people have done, and reads her mitochondrial haplogroup. It says K101B1A, and below that, in clean consumer font, the platform tells her this is common in European populations. She closes the laptop, goes back to her day. What that interface did not tell her, what it was not designed to tell her, is that K1A1B1A is one of 4 very specific maternal lineages identified in a landmark scientific study as the founding DNA of virtually all Ashkenazi Jews alive today. She just read her own origin story, and the software called it European. Dr. Doron Bahar was a researcher at the Rambam Medical Center in Haifa, Israel, working under Professor Karl Skorecki at the Technion. In 2006, his team completed mitochondrial DNA analysis of Ashkenazi Jewish communities worldwide and published something that still hasn't fully registered in the public mind. Close to half of all Ashkenazi Jews, roughly 3.5 million people, can be traced back to just 4 women. So 4 specific biological human beings, not myths, not metaphors, 4 real women who lived somewhere in Europe approximately 1,000 years ago, and their maternal lineages, passed from mother to daughter unchanged, expanded into the largest Jewish diaspora population in history. Now stay with me, because this is the part that changes everything. Those 4 founding maternal haplogroups, K101B1A, K109, N1B, and K2A2A, they don't only appear in Jewish populations. They show up in Northern Italian families, German Catholic families, French families, with no known Jewish ancestry. And a 2013 study published in Nature Communications by Dr. Martin Richards at the University of Huddersfield in England found something that ended a long-running debate. Those 4 founding mothers, the ones who started the entire Ashkenazi Jewish maternal line, most likely had ancestry in prehistoric Europe. Not the Near East. Let that land. The 4 biological mothers of half of all Ashkenazi Jews may have been European women who converted into Jewish communities. They may not have been born Jewish at all, which means that every consumer DNA algorithm currently labeling K101B1A as simply European is not wrong, but it is telling you an incomplete sentence. Because those European women's descendants entered the Catholic gene pool again through centuries of forced conversion and massacre and flight. Their lineages got absorbed back, recategorized. The label European was applied by the same historical process that applied the label Christian to families who'd been lighting candles every Friday for 200 years. That actually, real quick, if you watched my last video on Iran's DNA, you already saw the first half of this pattern, a population whose genome doesn't fit where history says it should be from. Did that change how you think about ancestry labels? Tell me in the comments below. And stay with me right now, because what's coming in this segment makes the Iran discovery look straightforward. The woman in Sao Paulo closed her laptop. She had no idea that the algorithm had just quietly skipped over 5 centuries of history. And right now, millions of people just like her have done exactly the same thing. But one woman in New Mexico didn't close the laptop. Her name was Elena Romero, born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1964, baptized Catholic, went to St. Joseph's Parish School, married a man named Carlos, raised 4 children, died in 2019. She spent her entire life identifying as Hispanic Catholic, and there was no reason to think of herself as anything else. In 2016, 3 years before she died, she mailed in a DNA test. Just curious, like so many people. Her daughter Maricela helped her register the kit. The result came back with a Y-chromosome marker in her paternal lineage, a marker inherited through her father's male line. It was J1C3, the Cohen Modal Haplotype, the genetic signature of the ancient Jewish priesthood. Maricela showed it to a genetic genealogist in Santa Fe, and the genealogist started working backward through church records, through Albuquerque, through New Mexico, through colonial New Spain, through the Atlantic, all the way back to a Converso registration document in Seville, 1495, 3 years after the Alhambra Decree. And the record listed the family name, Romero, and beside it, in the Inquisition's own handwriting, Nuevos Cristianos, New Christians. Here's the thing about the name Romero. It wasn't the family's name. Like thousands of surnames across the Iberian diaspora, Romero was assigned at conversion, a Christian name issued to replace whatever Hebrew family name they had carried before. Elena Romero had signed her name on every document of her life, her birth certificate, her marriage license, her diplomas, her death certificate, without knowing that name had been handed to her ancestors as a tool of erasure. The genetic clock on her specific J1C3 subbranch calculated the Levantine separation point at approximately 520 years before her birth, 1592, 1 year after the Alhambra Decree. This isn't just Elena's story. While genetic evidence suggests between 20 and 40% of Hispano-Catholic families in northern New Mexico carry markers like hers, most of them have never been told. 3 years after she got the DNA result, Elena drove to a Reformed Jewish synagogue in Albuquerque. She sat in the back during a Friday evening service. She didn't introduce herself to anyone. She didn't say why she was there. Her daughter Maricela says Elena wept quietly through the entire service. Not from religious feeling. Elena described it afterward as hearing a song she had never learned, but somehow already knew every word. She died Catholic in her own home, surrounded by her family, with a rosary in her hands. Her J1C3 marker lives now in 4 children and 7 grandchildren growing up in Albuquerque, being raised Catholic, not knowing. The cycle continues. In the memory still unspoken. The candle still lit on Friday evenings for reasons nobody in the house can name. But Elena's DNA held one more piece of information her daughter only learned after she was gone. The specific J1C3 sub-branch Elena carried has been linked in population studies to a founding dispersal event in the southern Levant, dated between 70 CE and 135 CE, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the siege of Masada. The specific catastrophe that scattered the priestly bloodline into every direction the Roman Empire's roads could reach. Elena Romero's DNA was not an ancestry curiosity. It was a scar from a specific wound inflicted in a specific year on a specific people, carried forward 1,950 years in a body that never knew it was carrying anything at all. That scar was made by Rome, and Rome believed for 2,000 years, that the wound was fatal. Let me make the case against everything this video has shown you so far. Let me argue that the Romans won. 70 CE. Roman general Titus Flavius, future emperor, destroys the Second Temple in Jerusalem. He kills or enslaves the majority of Judea's population. His father, Emperor Vespasian, mints a coin. It reads, Judea capta, Judea captured. 30 years after that, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, Emperor Hadrian expels all Jews from Jerusalem entirely. He renames the province Palestina, a deliberate act of cartographic erasure, removing the name Judea from every map in the empire. The temple is gone, the city is gone, the name is gone. By every political and military measure, it's over. And then the Ashkenazi Jewish population, which would become the world's largest Jewish community, suffers a catastrophic genetic bottleneck. By the early 15th century, researchers estimate the entire Ashkenazi founding population had compressed to roughly 50,000 people. The Inquisition before them, the Crusade massacres before that, the Black Death pogroms before that. Compression after compression after compression. By standard population genetics models, that bottleneck should have been enough. Enough genetic drift. Enough admixture with non-Jewish European populations. Within 5 to 6 generations, the distinctive genetic markers of a people that small should have dissolved completely into the European background. And yet, the data said the exact opposite. Dr. Gil Atzmon and his colleagues at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York published a study in 2010, Abraham's Children in the Genome Era, analyzing major Jewish diaspora populations worldwide. What they found was that Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, and Mizrahi Jews, populations separated by over 1,000 years of completely different geography, culture, and history, retained greater genetic similarity to each other than to any non-Jewish population in their respective host countries. Those 50,000 Ashkenazi founders in 1400 CE expanded to 5 million people by 1800. The markers survived every compression. They survived every expulsion. Rome's coin is still in the British Museum. So is the Arch of Titus, standing in Rome to this day, with Roman soldiers carved in stone carrying the temple menorah through the streets, like a monument to a conquest that achieved everything the Romans intended and nothing they actually needed. Because here's the thing, they couldn't conquer a chromosome. But here's where it gets strange, because the theory that tried to complete what Rome started didn't come from an enemy of the Jewish people. It came from a Jewish author, and for 40 years, it was used as a political weapon by people who had nothing but contempt for his community. The verdict took 30 years to deliver, and it was not close. In 1976, a writer named Arthur Koestler published a book called The 13th Tribe. Koestler was Jewish, a respected intellectual, a former communist, a man who had survived things most people couldn't imagine. His argument in the book was this: Ashkenazi Jews were not primarily descended from the ancient Israelites. Yeah, they were descended from the Khazars, a Turkic people who converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century CE in the Caucasus region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. If that was true, then the Cohen Modal Haplotype was coincidence, and Ashkenazi Jews had no ancestral genetic connection to the Levant at all. The book was published in 7 languages and widely read. It was also cited almost immediately in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda and in neo-Nazi pamphlets, both using the same argument. If Ashkenazi Jews are Khazars, not ancient Israelites, they have no genetic claim to any historical homeland. Kessler almost certainly didn't intend this. The problem was that his evidence predated modern genomics by 30 years. He was working with what existed in 1976, and what existed in 1976 wasn't good enough to settle the question. And the genomics settled it. Marcus Feldman at Stanford University, one of the most cited population geneticists in the world, put it plainly in 2013 after his team published their own analysis of Ashkenazi origins. If Ashkenazis were the spawn of Khazar royals, their DNA would show it. But those Y chromosomes were as Levantine as a Levant sandwich. The same genetic signature popped up on every Levite sampled, and that signature is absent in the Y chromosomes of modern European non-Jewish men and in male inhabitants of what was once Khazaria. The Khazar Y chromosome signature isn't in Ashkenazi Jews. The Levantine signature is. Haplogroups J1 and J2, the primary Y chromosome markers in Ashkenazi Jewish men, originate in the southern Levant. They appear at negligible frequencies throughout the historical Khazar geographic range, when every genomic analysis that tested the Khazar hypothesis found the same result. That finding was published over a decade ago. The Khazar theory is still sitting near the top of most internet searches on this topic. Nobody updated the internet. But here is the inversion that needs to be said clearly. The Khazar theory was built as a genetic argument to sever Ashkenazi Jews from the Levant. The genomic studies run to test it produced the opposite finding. The weapon built to delegitimize a connection became the instrument that confirmed it. And here's the part nobody talks about. If Ashkenazi Jews are genetically Levantine, which the evidence confirms, then millions of people around the world who have never identified as Jewish also carry those same Levantine markers in their cells right now. On people on every side of conflicts that are being fought, in part, over the question of who belongs where. The DNA does not take sides, but it does carry memory. There's something that gets lost when we talk about Jewish DNA, as if it were a category with clean edges. The genetic signature we've been following, Haplogroup J, in its J1 and J2 branches, did not begin with the ancient Israelites. It did not begin with any religion. Population genomics places the origin of Haplogroup J at approximately 30,000 to 40,000 years ago in the Arabian Peninsula. The people who would eventually become the ancient Israelites were not yet a people. They were not yet a culture. They were Paleolithic human beings in the Fertile Crescent, carrying a Y chromosome marker that would, tens of thousands of years later, end up in the DNA of a Catholic schoolteacher in São Paulo and a Muslim man in Morocco and a schoolgirl in Albuquerque who lights candles every Friday without knowing why. The specific lineage goes like this. Haplogroup J emerges in the Arabian Peninsula roughly 40,000 years ago. It splits into J1 and J2 somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. J1 reaches peak concentration in the southern Levant during the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 1,500 BCE. And then, slowly, out of the broader Canaanite Bronze Age population, the distinct culture that would become ancient Israel begins to crystallize. Not invented from nothing, not descended from the sky, condensed out of a population that was already there, already carrying that marker, already living on that land. Jewish DNA isn't a separate genetic category that appeared one day. It's a concentration, a crystallization of something that had been building in the southern Levant for thousands of years before the name existed. There are no words for a moment here. Just look at where this all began. That's how long this story has been running. And what's inside you, whatever haplogroup is in your cells right now, is part of that same continuous record. It predates every empire that has ever tried to own it. But in 2017, a preprint study began circulating among population geneticists. Researchers had analyzed ancient Canaanite DNA sampled from Bronze Age burial sites in modern-day Lebanon, people who had lived and died in that region between 1700 and 800 BCE. The findings were significant. Those ancient Canaanite genomes showed genetic continuity with multiple modern populations, including Lebanese, Palestinian, and Ashkenazi Jewish populations, which meant that both the biblical account of a Canaanite population replaced by incoming Israelites and the later Roman claim of a total population displacement after 70 CE were both contradicted by the ancient DNA. The paper was eventually published in a modified form after 2 years of peer-review dispute. The original preprint, with its more direct conclusions, was quietly removed from the server where it had been posted. It is no longer there. In 1999, a researcher named Tudor Parfit at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London published a study that most of the world completely missed. He had been working with the Lemba, a community of about 80,000 Bantu-speaking people living in Zimbabwe and South Africa. The Lemba had always told their children they were descended from ancient Jews. They practiced circumcision. They refused pork. They observed a weekly day of rest. They slaughtered animals with a specific kind of blade. They maintained a hereditary priestly clan called the Buba. The men of the Buba were set apart from other Lemba, held in higher ritual regard, their male lineage treated as something separate and sacred. For generations, the wider world treated all of this as mythology. Then the DNA came back. Parfit and his colleague Mark Thomas, working with a team that included Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews as comparison populations, found that the Lemba Y-chromosomes were clearly divided between Semitic and Bantu clades. And the Buba clan, the hereditary priestly lineage, carried the Cohen Modal Haplotype at a very high frequency. The same marker found in New Mexico Catholics, the same marker found in the Moroccan Berber from the Sus Valley, the same marker found in Jewish priestly families traced back 3,200 years to the Near East. It was in Zimbabwe, in a Bantu-speaking community, in men who spoke Venda and Shona and had no idea that the word Cohen existed. An elder named Mathiva, when he was shown the data, said something that stayed with the researchers. He said he always knew his people had come from across the water, from somewhere called Sina in the north, but he thought it was just a story. Now, you are telling me, he said, it is written inside us. Now hold all of this together at once. Catholic families in New Mexico, so carrying the priestly marker without knowing it. A Berber man in Morocco, carrying it without knowing it. Portuguese men identified as Old Christians, genetically indistinguishable from Sephardic Jews. A Bantu-speaking priestly clan in Zimbabwe, carrying it and knowing something. Not the science, but a memory, a story about where they came from that turned out to be true. 4 communities, 4 continents, 4 completely different languages, religions, and identities. 1 genetic signature. And this is where the ground shifts completely. Because if the Cohen Modal Haplotype appears in Catholic communities in New Mexico, in Muslim communities in Morocco, in Christian communities in Zimbabwe, in populations across Latin America, in people who have never sat in the same room, never shared a language, so never read the same book, then what we have been calling Jewish DNA is not a marker of a religion. It is not even purely a marker of a people in the way we normally think about that. It is the marker of an ancient Levantine priestly population that dispersed into every direction the ancient world allowed, became everything, and left its signature inside bodies that have spent centuries believing they were someone else entirely. In 2012, a study in BMC evolutionary biology found that Palestinian Arab populations from the West Bank carry a higher degree of genetic similarity to Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish populations than to most other Arab populations. The genetic distance between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs is smaller than the genetic distance between Ashkenazi Jews and Yemeni Jews, which the people in the most discussed territorial conflict of the modern era are, by the measure of the genome, among the closest relatives on the planet, not metaphorically, molecularly. The science doesn't adjudicate who lives where. It doesn't resolve anything political or historical or theological. What it does is this. It tells you that before all the borders, before all the names, before all the conversions and conquests and erasures, there was one population in one place. and it scattered. And it became Catholics in New Mexico and Muslims in Morocco and Bantu priests in Zimbabwe and school teachers in Sao Paulo who open Ancestry websites and read European and close the laptop and go back to their day. And somewhere, right now, a woman is lighting 2 candles as the sun goes down. She doesn't know why, but her DNA does. Zikranot +10.